The ancient Greek hoplite, or hoplite, was the backbone that made up the forces of the ancient Greek polis in the archaic and classical eras. However, how well protected were they? How well armoured were they? And how do they compare to other eras of military history? On one of my latest shorts, there was a lot of comments saying that hoplites aren't well armoured, and frankly, I disagree, and that's what this video is going to be talking about. I'm going to be covering the armament of the hoplite and really discussing how well armoured were they. Something that's very important to remember when we're talking about this era of history is that we're not talking about one static time period, so the armament of the hoplite changed and evolved. For instance, from the archaic era, fully equipped hoplite, you're looking at feet armour, greaves, thigh armour, cuirass, upper and lower arms, and a helmet, which is basically as good a coverage as you get throughout all of history. Coming into the era that I'm representing, around 475 BC, interestingly enough, they seem to drop those extra bits, which would indicate that there was an evolution, likely in the style of combat, as recent evidence suggests that the archaic era had a far more looser style of warfare, and coming into the classical, the phalanx really started to develop. Many people said that, well, your thighs and your arms are toast, and that very easy to get to a hoplite past his armour. One thing I'd like to point out is this, even without the shield, which is obviously the massive factor coming into the hoplite's armament, is even this is more armoured than most soldiers throughout history. If you look at the Romans, again, another shielded warfare tactic, but most of them don't even have greaves. Let's look at the Viking era warriors. Many of them didn't even have armour at all, or even if you did, you'd be looking at a helmet and a mail shirt, but again, no arm or leg protection. Let's have a look at the medieval period. Of course, that's a 1,000-year period, so when are we talking? Let's choose the 15th century, which is where most people say a 15th century knight was more armoured than a hoplite. Sure, but let's look at the men-at-arms of that period. Many of which just had a helmet and padded jacket, or helmet and cuirass, many of which, just like the hoplites who had to afford their own armour, weren't head to toe in armour. So regardless, even taking the shield out of the equation, this level of armament is more than, I'd say, most of human history. Look at modern soldiers as well. But of course, it's silly to judge a warrior without judging the type of warfare that he's fighting in, and that is, of course, optimal for how he fights. The armour that they use is optimal for the style of combat that they use. If you look at many of those styles of warfare that I mentioned, Romans, Vikings, etc., they all revolved around having massive shields, which obviously protected you a lot. So let's focus in on the era of history that I am. So this is, similar to the Persian Wars, typically probably slightly after, but around that time. In that time period, I would have been a very well-armoured soldier. I've got a bronze cuirass, a bronze helmet, bronze greaves, and that's basically as armoured as you would have gotten. Probably a minority of soldiers were this well equipped, many of which, again, because as a hoplite was a citizen militia force, they would have had to have purchased their own equipment and weapons, so if you couldn't afford a cuirass, you'd have to go without it. What is interesting, though, is some other people also commented that greaves were not more important, or arguably weren't a very important piece of armour. And again, they're talking about an era of history that isn't Greek warfare. If you're fighting with a massive shield, and you are fighting in a shield wall, the only part of your body that's significantly uncovered are the shins. They were incredibly important, and that's why we see, again, when we see this evolution of almost dropping armour, the greaves are never dropped. We see many hoplites with helmet and greaves with no cuirass. We don't see many hoplites with helmet and cuirass and no greaves. Again, these people knew what they were doing. This armour lasted for quite literally hundreds of years. If it wasn't good, they wouldn't have worn it. And you can see how well covered I am. Even my weapon arm, which people pointed out is not protected, is predominantly covered, and I can get very quick jabs, not really exposing my arm, and it's back covered behind. And the shield goes from my neck down to my knee, protecting my thighs, my groin, and my entire torso and both my arms, which is why I typically say the greaves are actually arguably more important than the cuirass, and it would seem the ancients agreed. Another thing I'd like to say is just because certain eras of history had more armour doesn't mean they both can't be true at the same time. Hoplite could still be incredibly well armoured, though there's people that are more armoured. The Rock is a very strong person, however Eddie Hall is stronger. That's not to say that The Rock isn't strong. They can both be true at the same time. People really don't take into account the style of warfare that these armours were made to be used in, and that is fundamentally the most important part of this. Is, again, we see many hoplites that would not be this well armoured. Probably a majority of them would not be this well armoured, but because you're fighting in the classical age in a phalanx covered by shields, which are massive, okay, not actually that heavy, about 13 pounds, but massive. They offer a lot of protection, a lot of protection. Again, just to demo how much of me is covered, and then imagine a row of us, thousands across and 7 deep, marching towards you. Some of you might want to comment about overhand. I will be doing as I clip my bush, I will be doing a full video explaining that, so please leave your comments for that video. It's very unfair to judge a warrior and compare him to medieval armour, which is 1,000 years later, with 1,000 years more development. And again, the Greeks literally evolved out of these limb armours. So whether we can say for certain why they did this? No. Likely because they found it wasn't worth the cost, it wasn't worth the extra weight, and frankly that their warfare seemed to protect them and they weren't getting that many hits in the areas that they weren't armoured, because these people weren't stupid, right? Again, this style of warfare lasted for hundreds of years, this style of armour lasted for hundreds of years. If it didn't work, they would have moved on, and they didn't very quickly. This armament is built around having that shield to protect you, and even without that shield you are still incredibly well covered. Even if we compare the lightest armed hoplite, which is say a pilos helmet, a chiton with a shield, still well over 50% of his body is protected. It's just his legs that aren't, which is still a massive amount of protection. So, were hoplites well armoured? In short, yes, and I think it's fair to say yes, comparing them to most eras of human warfare. The fundamental part that people seem to not take into account is the armour built around and working in collaboration with the equipment of the time, which of course is incredibly important. Someone argued that which for me I think is one of the dumbest arguments I had, not to sound rude here, but that you'd think that a super well armoured opponent wouldn't fight in a formation, would you? Because they would be so well armoured they wouldn't need a formation. What? So let me twist that back for you here. What do you think is a better fighting force? 1,000 well armoured people, or working together, or one fighting thousands of well-armoured people? Obviously the group. There's a reason that riot-controlled police form walls and work together. They're way more equipped and unarmoured than the rioters that they're fighting. Surely they'd be able to just single-handedly go in there, not in a formation. But of course you're stronger in a formation. That argument for me, it honestly shocked me. I've never described myself as an expert, but sometimes reacting to YouTube comments makes me feel like an expert. That being said, it's of course very good to question narratives and question people that are making videos online, but at the same time, don't be hostile, don't be rude, don't be degrading, don't act like that you know more than them just because you watched one YouTube video from another channel, or you read one article that was saying that the hoplite got its name from the hoplon, which again is going to be another video that we'll be discussing that. In short, it doesn't. Just stay respectful. And yes, I would say the hoplite, even comparing him to most eras of human history, was a very armoured soldier. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learnt something, and thank you very much to our members who have been supporting the channel, even more so than just watching the videos, liking and subscribing. And welcome to those of you that are new. We've got a massive influx of new people, as that previous short basically just went viral. It's just reached over 1 million views, which I honestly cannot believe. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too sharp. I just thought I may as well make a video response to these many comments saying that hoplites weren't well armoured, as well, I think it speaks for itself.